Hi and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today I'll be showing you how I painted my Garlon Souleater, including the base that we've got on there with a pit that's got a 3D printed bit from DeadlyPrint Studios. You can buy the STLs or you can buy the full 3D printed part. So I've got two sub-assemblies. So I've got Garlon on one little stand, and then I've added the base. So that 3D part, as I said, was from DeadlyPrint Studios. It's not actually designed for this model, but I thought it worked quite well. It's actually designed, I think, for maybe Ahriman or for the Thousand Suns. I've done it for this model. So I've base coated everything in black. I'm using Vallejo black primer, added a few skulls and tufts, and now I'm going to be using Vallejo White Ink through the airbrush. Quite a cheap airbrush that I use, only about a £30 airbrush. So size 0.4 nozzle and a PSI of about 40. Obviously airbrushes and they vary in you thin your paints and sort of the quality of your airbrush that you're using. And the compressor that you're using as well, but mine are the sort of Fengda stuff from Amazon. I think all in all it was about £100 for everything. And all I'm doing here really is I'm just priming the actual base pretty much with white. There is a little bit of focusing on pure white in the areas that I want to be brighter, leaving a little bit of the sort of overspray of the airbrush to areas that I want to be darker. I want the primary areas of brightness to be where the flame magic has started, around by those skulls at the bottom there, a little bit in the middle, and then around that sort of fireball part there where it's swirling around him. There's also some little flames and bits that are clicking off of it where I add some extra little sprays of white. But just remember, where you want it to be brighter, have more white intensity, and where it's darker, just let the overspray cover a little bit of it. Leave it a few minutes to dry, as it is pure white ink. It does take a little bit of time to dry. And then we're going to move on to adding our fluorescents. And what I use here is I use AK Fluorescent Magenta and some Dale & Rowney fluorescent sort of pink or fluorescent rose fluorescent magenta ink. And I add a few drops. It's probably about a 3-to-1 mix. So 3 drops of AK Fluorescent Magenta and 1 drop of ink. It just really just waters down the AK paint, so it just flows out of the airbrush a little bit easier. You could just use water, but if you use ink you still maintain that intensity of colour, but you get a nice watered down paint going through the airbrush so it doesn't clog up. But because it is quite thin, you have to take your time when airbrushing this over because it is quite wet. So just gently apply this paint through the airbrush onto the model, moving it as you're doing it so you don't get pooling in certain areas, and it will take 4 or 5 passes of the airbrush to get a full coverage of this paint. Try not to leave any white areas, cover all of it, and even allow the overspray to spray over some of the rest of the base as well. So there's the coverage there, so you already see where we've got those different. I'm adjusting my light here just so you can see how it looks under different lights. Obviously the brighter light, it whites the camera out, but you can already see there where we've got the intensity of the white ink underneath is a lot more brighter. So now what I want to do is I want to tone down some of those areas that I want to be in the shadows. So I'm using Green Stuff World Fluorescent Violet. And all I'm going to be doing here is this is a little drop of water has been added just to thin it down a little bit. And all I'm doing here is I'm adding this to the areas that I want to be sort of cold, the darker areas. So bright means hot, dark means cold. So I'm just dulling down some areas now, which is the rocks that are coming out, and underneath I want it to be a little bit darker. So anywhere where you want to be dark, you can just spray a couple of little squirts of this AK Violet, not too much because you want it to still be bright in certain areas, but again not too little because having that contrast between dark and light really sells. I also spray this over the skulls and over that little bit of base just so it tones down the magenta shine that's coming through from our first coverage. And again, just leave it a few minutes to dry. We're going to be moving over to brushwork now, and the brushwork, what we're going to be doing is painting some areas back into white so that we can re-emphasize some of the glowing areas. So this is now what I want to do is I'm going to be using AK Intense White, and I will be wanting to now create really bright points. And of course white is the best for fluorescent paints to go over to get that real intensity. So all the little flames that are sticking out the top, I'm just painting in pure white. I also paint like where the fireball is in pure white, and the areas where I want it to be really intense glowing, I also add some white streaks. Don't worry that it's pure white, we're going to be doing a little contrast trick in a minute just to help blend some of that white, so it looks like it's gradually getting from sort of almost an airbrush effect, but using a sort of contrast ink mix. So now I'm going to grab my contrast white ink mix. And what this is a contrast medium pot that I emptied the contrast medium out of, and then I made a mix of it's about 2 parts white ink to 1 part water and 1 part medium. It sort of varies as I make this mix, just because I add a little bit more white ink sometimes, but generally the sort of 2 parts ink, 1 part contrast medium and 1 part water. Then I just made a bulk load of this and added it into the pot, and what this creates for you is like a white ink contrast wash, which works like a contrast paint or a shade paint, in that where you paint this, it will naturally pool in the deeper recesses, and then it leaves a sort of gradient effect either side of it, like a shade paint would. And then you can use this to help blend in areas that you know we're going to be over painting with the fluorescent paint or any other colour, and that you'll get a nice transition from sort of a gradient in white into a pure white. So what I do is here is I add this into the areas surrounding the pure white that we've done, just so that we get a nice intensity pure white in the centre and it gradients out. Once that contrast mix is dry, good 10-15 minutes it will take, I then use some AK Fluorescent Orange, and I paint over all of the white and a little bit of the surrounding area in this colour. It will need a couple of coats. You could go back to using the airbrush if you wanted to, but I just wanted to show that you can easily paint this on as well. It just takes a few coats with the brush to paint this over, and what you'll see is you'll get a nice transition from a sort of magenta into an orange, which gives it a sort of ethereal look. You could just overpaint this with the magenta again if you wanted just bright magenta as your brightest colour, but I find this transition into the orange really stands out. And whilst that sort of stuff, that orange is drying, I'm now just going to focus on darkening down the model, this 3D bit. So I'm going to do some dry brushing. I've got an Artify Drybrush. Just going to be using a handful of colours. So first off, I've got some AK Tenebrous Grey. I've then got some AK Grim Brown, some AK Mud Brown, and then some AK Light Earth. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be using the Grim Brown first, and this will be just applied all over the base itself, and this will give the sort of the base a sort of dark brown undercoat, as it were, but it's kind of just a heavy dry brush. And I actually dry brush this so that we dry brush away from our glowing effect and down into the grim brown colour. I then apply some mud brown over the top of the grim brown, a slightly lighter dry brush, and then an even lighter dry brush with the AK Light Earth, so that we get nice transitions from really dark brown to sort of a light bony type brown. And these colours are great not only for getting a nice sort of dirty floor effect, but also great colours for skulls as well, because it gives a sort of dusty look to them. Once you're happy with the base, I then grab the Tenebrous Grey and put that onto my dry brush, get most of it out. Then I just lightly dry brush over the rocks that are in that magic effect, and just dry brush it over the raised areas, so that now we get transitions between some of the darker areas and the brighter areas, so that if it was like a flame or a dark, so to get that, we just dry brush it with a very dark colour. You could use like a Corvus black, any very dark grey. You don't want to use pure black. These darker greys help sell the effect. And you can see I just lightly dry brush over a little bit of the flames, so that it just picks out those raised areas, leaving the glow in the deep recesses. I then add a little bit of light earth onto the dry brush, and then just dry brush that over the top of those rocks, so those get some contrast from dark to light as well. Now you could just leave the base like that, but I just add one final touch where I grab some dirty down rust and just apply that over the base of the model, just because I like getting the rust effect. And Huron, who I painted previously, has this effect also with the dirty rust, and I wanted to keep that across all of the models in this little box set that you get, that Maelstrom box set. So this dirty down rust, I just applied dots of it, big globs of it, in the areas where I want it to be most rusty, or most dirty rusty colour, and then just transition that out with a few drops of water, almost wet blending it across the model so that we get a nice rusty effect. And then that dirty down rust takes a good 10-15 minutes to dry, and as it was drying I grabbed some AK Fluorescent Yellow, and all I'm going to be doing here is the areas that I want to be the brightest, I just add a few dots of this fluorescent yellow into those areas to really help sell the glowing effect. So that's in the little central areas where I really want it to be bright, in the base around the skulls, and the fireball part at the end. And then once you're done with that, I mean, that is really the base done. You can just paint the rim obviously in black, and that's your base all finished. So now we're moving on to Garlon himself. Now I'm using a new colour that I've been sent, which is from the Ionic range. This is the Ionic Red, and it's I added 1 drop of water into it to thin it down, and it is an incredibly bright red, considering we're painting this over black. Oh, actually, this is painting over Tenebrous Grey. Sorry, I am painted over the model in Tenebrous Grey, but even so, it's almost black. This coverage is absolutely awesome. I will try painting it over white on a separate model, but painting over black, it only needed 2 coats, and actually, in a way, you could get away with 1. It's got such good coverage. But all I'm doing with Garlon is anything for the red armor, I'm base coating in this Ionic Red. Once the base coating is done, I then grab some Nuln Oil from Citadel and just paint over all of the red with Nuln Oil. And that's sort of it for now for the red armour. There's not too much sewing, and actually there's a lot of other details on the model that sort of blend in with the armour, so that's it for the armour for now. What I'm going to do now is paint his robes, and for that I'm doing a base coat of AK Dragon Blood, and this covers all of the robes, so no need to use any other colour here. This AK Dragon Blood, there's not much like it. It's a very purplish colour with a hint of red to it. I'm not quite sure what other in the Citadel range would cover this. It's sort of like a corn red, but even darker with some purple. And this is the sort of base of our robes, and what we'll be building up from, doing a few, not wet blending, but doing blends from this Dragon Blood up into Magenta. So once you've painted all the robes, I then get some AK Magenta and put that onto the wet palette. What we do is it's probably about a 70-30 mix. So just add in some magenta until you get a nice transition, not a mid-tone, a sort of slightly higher mid-tone from the Dragon Blood to the magenta. And then add a little drop of water into this as well, so that it's nice and thin, so that you get nice transitions. And what I'm doing here is I'm covering probably 60-70% of the robes, making sure that we edge highlight all of the robes, and then we pick out all of the raised areas and any creases, leaving that Dragon Blood in just the deepest recesses and any areas you want to still be in shadow. Then once we've finished that first mix, I then just add more magenta into the mix to brighten it up, and then I reduce the coverage area, so now probably down to about 30% coverage with a drop of water in there as well. So again, making sure we edge highlight, making sure we just pick out those raised areas in this bright color. I wanted the robes to be sort of saturated. I didn't want them to be too bright. I just wanted to just not, yeah, because the bright part is going to be our magic. I didn't want anything else to be brighter than that glowing effects that we've got. So now I'm using some Flayed One Flesh from Citadel, and I add a few drops of that to the wet palette. Then I do a mix of magenta and Flayed One Flesh so that we get a very desaturated sort of pink colour. So that's we'll be mixing it in with the mix we've already made and a couple of drops of water there. So what this is doing is it's creating a desaturated pink, so it looks extremely worn when used on material. So all I do here is on very specific areas where it's extremely raised or on the edges, I do some edge highlighting with this and add some scratches and scrapes. If it is too bright, just add a little bit more of the sort of mix that we've already got into it. But this is a very subtle highlight, but it will sell the effect of material, especially warm material, if you're just picking out the highlights and some tears and some scratches with this. so with the robes done, we're now going to move over to the sort of leather areas, which is going to be a base coat of grim brown. So anything that you want to be leather and bone as well, you can paint with the grim brown. So here I'm going to be painting like the leather work. I'm going to be doing the scrolls and the skulls and bones, and also I do his staff because I wanted his staff to be looking like a bit of bone. There's also some skulls around his waist, so anything that's in that sort of realm, I will base coat them all with this AK Grim Brown. Once those areas are base coated, we then use AK Leather Brown, and this is our first highlight. So with a leather brown, so anything you want to be leather, just pretty much cover about 90%, leaving only the darkest recesses in the grim brown. I also use this to do the initial highlights on the skulls. So it's almost just picking out all of the raised areas, leaving only grim brown left in the deepest recesses for the skulls, like inside the sockets, any joins with any material, just leave a little bit of that grim brown showing, and just slightly dry brush it over the teeth. So this is now where we split apart and we start just focusing on the leather. And so the next colour I use is AK Saddle Brown, which is a nice pinkish brown, great for leathers. So with this I do an edge highlight of anything I want to be leather, and then add some scratches and marks just to show some wear and tear on the leather itself. the final highlight on the leather, I use some Citadel Cadian Fleshtone, a little bit of water mixed into it as well, and this is a very subtle edge highlight, only covering about 20-30% of our original highlight, and just adding a few scrapes onto it as well. You could, if you wanted to, then add a little bit of pallid witch flesh or flayed one flesh, any pale flesh colour as a final highlight for leather work. But again, I didn't want anything too bright because I wanted the focus to be on our other glowing effects. Now we're moving to finish off the skulls and the bones, and for that we're using, like we did with the base, we're going to be using some mud brown from AK, and again this is just applying it on the skulls or anything you want to be bone, almost like this is our sort of third highlight now, where we start picking out the detail. As you can see here with the brushwork, I'm not being extremely careful, I'm still focusing on the area I want to paint, but I'm doing it in sharp lines and scratches and marks, so that the skulls look heavily worn. And that's the same with the skull, the goat skull that's on his backpack and on his shoulder plate. And next highlight for the bone is Light Earth from AK. Again, same principles we've just done, but on a very smaller area. So just picking them out. I make a little mix here, like 50-50, to get a nice gradient approach. If you're dry brushing, you just go one to the other. But when on the brush work, I just do a little gradient of colour in the middle there, add a little bit of water to it, and then just pick out the details, the sockets, the nose, the eyes, any scrapes and scratches pick out with this. And then I move to just pure Light Earth as the final highlight. So that's all the skulls and leather work done. We're now going to move on to the armor, and following the box art, the armor is almost pure black with just a silver edge highlight, and that's what I'm going to be replicating. So anything that you want to have be silver armor, just keep the black, or this is the Tenebrous Grey, and then just do very subtle edge highlights around all of the armor. You can add little scratches and scrapes here and there to show some wear and tear. The gold is slightly different, so anything you want to be gold, which I've painted the sort of top of his staff, the chaos symbol, and the little sort of scroll pouches that he's got, and his helmet. I've base coat all of it in AK Rusty Gold, which is a nice dark, sort of worn gold. And then just to tone down the overall shine, I use some Citadel Reikland Fleshshade, and I just put that all over what we've just painted gold. It'll also help the edge highlighting of the gold stand out a little bit more. Before we do the edge highlighting of the gold, we're going to be adding some other glowing effects to this, which is going to be the glowing effect of his eyes, a couple of the buttons, and the vents from the backpack. And to get that, we just use a few colours. So first of all, it's AK Wine Red, then AK Blood Red, then it's back to the Intense White, and then some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. So the Wine Red is our cold colour. The Blood Red adds our first glow, with the white adding where we want the intensity to be, and the fluorescent red adding the glow. So what we do first of all is we paint anything that you want to be like bright red glowing with this wine red. So this is around the eyes, remembering to paint a little bit around the outside of the eyes as well, because this is the sort of afterglow of our glowing effect. The button that's on his like iconography on his little spear, I paint the button itself plus the surrounding area in the red, and all of the red on the vents on his backpack. So with the blood red, this is where we start to add the intensity. So with the blood red, I paint the eye itself, and then paint a little bit in that central part of his mouthpiece. I paint the button in the red, then I also paint the central part of the vents in blood red, leaving the surrounding area in wine red. We then do the same principle in white, but with the white we just add a dot in each of the eye, dot on the button, and a couple of dots in the vents. And then we paint over all of it with the fluorescent red, and then add a little bit of fluorescent orange just to really make the glowing effect sell. Just to finish the gold off, was actually because I was waiting for the Reikland Fleshshade to dry whilst I was doing that. For the gold, all I do is use some AK Old Gold, which is like Retributor armor from Citadel, and I just do some edge highlighting, picking out anything I want to be bright gold with this AK Old Gold to get a nice transition from the dark to light. To highlight the black items, I make a little mix of the Tenebrous Grey that I've got there and a little bit of white, probably about a 70-30 mix, and just use that to highlight any of the black areas. Saves getting the grey out of the paint pots. And then to highlight the red armor, I just use some Cadian, not Cadian Fleshtone. You can use Cadian Fleshtone to highlight red armor, but I actually use, yeah, I do use some Cadian Fleshtone, and that's just used to just do a few subtle highlights on the red armor. Not too much. There's not much to highlight really. You can use any sort of desaturated pink color to highlight the red armor. can see in those next stages, I was just adding a glowing effect to the sort of magical orbs that's on the top of his armor. I then, with the brush almost empty of the fluorescent red, I just add a little bit of that to all the red armor panels just to intensify the redness. This is an optional stage, but I thought it just looked nice over the edge highlights and sort of give them a sort of slight more intensity to how the edge highlight looks. Okay, one of the final stages now is adding the glowing effect to the inside of his hand. So what I do first of all is, obviously we didn't highlight this hand at all. So I'm going to be using a couple of colours. It's the AK Magenta, the AK Intense Pink, and then some white. And then going over it with some fluorescence. So the first off, what I want to do is I want to paint pretty much all of the bottom of his hand here where this glowing effect, this magic is coming from. I'm going to be painting that purely in the AK Magenta, as that's the coldest colour that we've got with this glowing effect. I then use some slightly watered down AK Intense Pink to paint this into the areas that I want to be really, really bright, and then just some areas after that where that's sort of still glowing from. And we're going to be painting over all of this in a fluorescent colour anyway, but this is just to add the base of our glowing. I then grab the white and watering it down a little bit instead of getting out a little contrast mix. I'd add some watered down white into the very central part, into his palm really, where I want it to be most. Then I use the AK Fluorescent Magenta and paint over the whole of the hand with that Fluorescent Magenta. It's a couple of coats that it takes to fully cover it. I then do a little bit of Fluorescent Orange again in the middle and a little bit of Fluorescent Yellow, much like we did with the flame effect. I'm just doing that on his hand. It's exactly the same principles. So the glow intensifies by putting some orange in there, and then intensifies even more with a little bit of Fluorescent Yellow. And then once that's done, I stuck him onto the base. He fits on there quite nicely, and there we have him with his glowing effect swirling around. We've got that intensity there in the palm. And now this is where I'm adding that fluorescent yellow just to sell it a little bit more. I actually apply a little bit too much, so I just clean the brush off there and just wick some of that paint off with a slightly wet brush. I wanted just to have a bit more intensity onto the base and to get some of that onto the model itself. So I just get that dirty down rust again, apply a little bit to the base, and then with a very wet brush just apply that water and dirty down mix across the sort of his feet and the bottom of his cloak, just so that the two areas blend in together. I then apply it just underneath some of that magic effect where it's a little bit violet, and I wanted just to show that the ground was there. And a couple of coats of that dirty down rust really intensifies the sort of dirty rustiness of the whole thing. I think it gives the base a really good effect. And then I left it a good 10-15 minutes for all to dry, and this is what we're left with. So this is our Garlon Souleater with a nice DeadlyPrint Studio 3D bit, giving us a nice magic effect. It doesn't make the base too big, so it can still be used on the battlefield. It just adds some character and momentum to this model. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this painting tutorial. Obviously you can use the guide for the base across any of your other models, and obviously how to paint Garlon can be used across any of the sort of red Corsairs, the guides, the little maelstrom box that you can get. So as always, like, comment and subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.